Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Bitter Pill. Uh, as you may notice here, I'm recording this on a new platform using a new program, uh, OBS Studio. I had been using QuickTime, which is a Mac program that comes with a Mac. I'm actually on my PC in Linux today using OBS Studio because it's just a much more powerful program for creating the kind of videos that you want with all the effects you want and bells and whistles and so forth. Took me a while to get around to making the time to learn about using it. Um, it turns out it was premature in I was premature in deciding that I knew what I was doing because yesterday I tried to make this video, and in fact earlier today, I tried to make this video. Uh, I think like 3 times overall, and kept running into problems. So it was reversing colors, so blue was orange and orange was blue in some cases on the browser window. Um, and the default settings that OBS Studio comes with are you put way too much of a load on my dinky little uh, computer with its i5 processor. So I had to figure all that out, and hopefully, fingers crossed, I now have things working smoothly and can make this video without a hitch. At any rate, the topic that I want to get into today is evaluating what happened in the elections this year and indeed elections over the years in terms of various ways in which the two parties have stacked the deck in terms of the outcome in this or that election. And, you know, that's not to say that there aren't elections where, a candidate from either the Democratic or Republican parties legitimately wins, and there's not any known issues with nefarious tactics by either party, at least not ones that would affect the outcome. Because there's always an issue with people not being able to vote because of they've been suspiciously kicked off the voter rolls, or their identification was refused, or they weren't given the appropriate ballot, or all kinds of things happen to interfere with voters' rights to cast their vote for the candidates of their choice and have those votes be counted properly. But anyway, I first got interested in the issue of the fairness of our electoral system back in 2000. When I was involved in Ralph Nader's campaign. I was a volunteer here in Indiana for Ralph Nader's campaign, and then later, as this article discusses, I went on to run for Congress as a Green Party candidate in the next election, 2002. And as I wrote here, what happened in the 2000 election was burned into my brain, still is, as if it were yesterday. Because this was the first presidential election in my lifetime, at least that I knew about, where the winner clearly won by cheating. And where a progressive third-party candidate, Ralph Nader in this case, so successfully inspired people and got a lot of votes for a third-party candidate, even though nowhere enough to be near enough to be a threat to win. But as I'm sure you've heard, Democrats love to blame Ralph Nader and the people who voted for him for George Bush winning, quote unquote, winning that election. But in reality, uh, the outcome in Florida, which decided the election in terms of the electoral college outcome for George Bush over Al Gore, Florida was rigged. There's no doubt about it. George Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, happened to be governor of Florida at the time, and his henchmen, most especially Secretary of State Katherine Harris, went out of their way to deny people who were likely to be favorable to Al Gore or the Democrats generally, particularly black people in Florida, to deny them their right to vote. And the main way they did this was by accusing people of being felons, of having a felony conviction on their record, who in fact were not felons. Almost every single one of the tens of thousands of people who were accused of this and thus thrown off the voter registration list because it's illegal, or it was at the time illegal to vote in Florida if you have a felony record. And that clearly cost Al Gore Florida and thus the election. Because the election was only decided by about 500 votes. 537 is a figure that sticks in my mind. It's one less than the number of electoral votes that there are overall. But anyway, so tens of thousands of people, most of whom would have voted Democratic, were denied their right to vote. There were other shenanigans or mishaps in the election, such as in Palm Beach County, there was a very poorly designed ballot that confused people about which bubbles that you fill in to indicate the candidate that you're voting for went with which candidate. So, amusingly but disappointingly, shockingly, a lot of Jewish voters in Palm Beach County, among others, mistakenly voted because they were confused by the ballot for Pat Buchanan, the Reform Party candidate who was, is a notorious anti-Semite. But the main thing that happened in Florida was this effort to throw people off the voter registration lists, and that's been the main tactic that the Republican Party has used over the years to rig elections, denying people their right to vote, particularly people who were likely to vote for their Democratic opponents. Black and brown people, poor people, college students, etc. And it's likely, when you look at the evidence, that this decided the presidential election in 2004 as well. That voter suppression in Ohio, in particular, decided the election for George Bush for his re-election over John Kerry. In 2016, there was a program to systematically disenfranchise black and brown voters, instituted across several states by Chris Kobach, at the time the Secretary of State in Kansas. And basically what they did was they identified people with in common last and perhaps first names. I don't know, Jeremy Smith or something like that, and then searching for their first and last names in other states, and even if their middle name didn't match up, even if there were other reasons why they should have known it wasn't the same person, they would strike that person's name off the ballot because they claimed that the same person had registered in multiple states. Well, you might ask, well, why would the Republicans do this? Well, the reason they did this is because, as it turns out, it just happens to be the case that black and Hispanic people in the United States are the people, the demographic groups who have the most common last names. Like there are way more black people named Smith or Jones or etc. Proportionately than there are white people, for example. And so by disenfranchising more voters of color than other voters, they helped Republican candidates. And it's pretty much certain that that's the reason why Donald Trump won in 2016. Of course, there were other factors too. Hillary Clinton was corrupt and ran a terrible campaign. Donald Trump hit upon issues that resonated with a lot of voters, and so forth and so on. Still lost the popular vote by a couple million votes, about 3 million votes, but won the Electoral College thanks to narrow victories in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which are 3 of the states. There were also other close states that went in his favor, and in all of them, pretty much, this interstate cross-check program that was systematically disenfranchising a lot of likely Democratic voters. It was a decisive factor in the outcome. In 2018, same thing happened in the state of Georgia when Brian Kemp, the Georgia Secretary of State, was running for governor. Conveniently enough, the Secretary of State is who runs the state's elections, and he, with input from that genius from Kansas, Chris Kobach, came up with a new scheme, interstate cross-check having been investigated and forced to disband by that point. But they came up with a new scheme where they would mail out postcards to people checking to see whether they had moved. And the idea was, if somebody didn't return a postcard saying, yes, I still live at this address, that meant that they had moved, and therefore they should be tossed off the voter registration lists. Even though, if you haven't moved out of state, you still have the right to vote in that state. You just need to change your address on your registration if you've moved. But they threw people off anyway, regardless of, in fact, whether they had moved at all. There were many people they tossed off the voter registration list who, in fact, had not moved at all. Overall, between those people and people who had moved but were still residing in Georgia, they threw off about 200,000 voters who, guess what, were more likely to be people of color or poor people, as well as younger voters, such as college students, because those are people who are most likely to move and also most likely to discard something like a postcard from the state as junk mail in a lot of cases. So they were getting tossed out disproportionately because for whatever reason, either because they had moved or so, because they just didn't return the postcard, they were getting tossed off the voter registration lists. And they didn't just send those out to every Georgia voter. I don't think they did target it somewhat in ways that you can guess. So anyway, Brian Kemp is now the governor of Georgia, thanks to that effort at voter suppression. And there have been others, very onerous voter ID laws, and Democrats are not above such tactics. In 2016, in Brooklyn, New York, where the New York primary was looking to be pretty competitive between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, but in Brooklyn, they came up with a scheme to throw people off the registration lists by such nefarious tactics as registering them as the wrong party when they tried to register as Democrats, so they could vote in New York's closed primary, where you can only vote in it if you're a Democrat in the Democratic primary. And other ways they went about it, resulting in, these voters who were switching their registration or newly registering, etc., as Democrats were much more likely to be Sanders voters than Clinton voters, and so undoubtedly that cost Bernie Sanders a lot of votes. And I wrote a whole article about all the rigging that went on in 2020, which may have been even worse than 2016. But if you define it more broadly to include the way the media spin things, for instance, that was a big factor in 2020, as in 2016, where the media coverage was very heavily skewed in favor of corporate Democrats like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, and against, very negative towards progressive challengers like Bernie Sanders, and then this time people like Tulsi Gabbard and Marianne Williamson and so forth. And another thing that they did this time was they made it very difficult for candidates who were not well known to get into the presidential debates. So they set up very obscure requirements about which polls would or wouldn't count toward your being in the debate. And they kept a number of candidates out of debates this year, last year, I guess, through this tactic. Mike Gravel, probably the most progressive of any of the Democratic challengers, never got into any debates at all, because basically they screwed him out of qualifying by letting people in who met only one of their qualifications, if they had the right politics, but they didn't let him in, even though he met one of the qualifications, which was how many people contributed to your campaign. And there were all sorts of other things they did. Infamously, in Iowa, the Democratic Party, at first they said it wasn't the Democratic Party, but it turned out that the DNC was directly involved in developing an app to count and report the votes in the Iowa Democratic Caucus. And basically what happened, as Jordan Chariton from Status Quo talks about in this article that he got published in The Intercept, is that the Democrats who had access to the results on the night that the votes had come in the Iowa caucus, they chose to sit on them and not release them to the media or anyone else who didn't also have direct access to them, and so the media collaborated with them and spun this as Pete Buttigieg is winning, but we don't know who won. And so basically they were able to rob Bernie Sanders of momentum that he would have gotten from winning the Iowa caucus, which he actually did by a small amount in the popular vote. And there was another shenanigan where one of the people who was polled in the main pre-Iowa primary election poll complained that they hadn't asked him when the pollster called him on the phone if he wanted to vote for Pete Buttigieg. And so as a result of that one voter complaining about you know, not being asked the questions about who they were voting for properly, they just canceled the whole poll. And this is like the main poll that has the best methodology and so forth that was relied on for people reporting about the Iowa caucus. And it would have showed Bernie Sanders with a big lead in Iowa. And there were also the usual voter suppression tactics that worked. So there were a number of locales, such as college campuses and black neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods, and so forth, where polling locations were closed. So they deliberately restricted the number of polling places, so people would have to stand in long lines to vote, and maybe they didn't have time to because they had to go to work or whatnot. So that biased the outcome. There were also shenanigans pulled in California, similar to those pulled by the Republicans in various general elections over the years, where they basically disenfranchised a lot of independents who were trying to vote in the Democratic primary by making it very difficult to figure out how exactly you did that. You had to request what they called a crossover ballot if you were an independent who wanted to vote for Democrat, and they didn't really tell people that. And Greg Palast, an investigative journalist, calculated that roughly 500,000 California voters were robbed of their right to vote by these tactics by the Democratic election officials, and pretty overwhelming majority of them were people who were likely to have voted for Bernie Sanders, the polls suggest. If the Democrats are so willing to cheat in the primaries for purposes of making sure that their preferred corporate establishment candidate, like a Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton, to make sure that they won, and a more progressive candidate such as Bernie Sanders didn't win, well then why wouldn't they cheat in the general election? It's not that they would have any ethical qualms, certainly, about not cheating in the general election, but one thing to consider is how much do they really care about whether a Republican such as Donald Trump wins the general election, versus how much do they care about stopping someone like Bernie Sanders from getting the Democratic nomination. And as I've talked about on this show before, I think pretty clearly they are a lot more concerned with making sure that their hand-picked candidate, who isn't going to rock the boat, is going to toe the line in terms of serving corporate interests and the war machine and so forth. They want to make sure that that type of candidate is who wins their nomination, and make sure that people like Bernie Sanders, or back in the day George McGovern or Jesse Jackson, do not get the nomination. That's what they're most concerned with. Now, that's not to say that they didn't want Joe Biden to win in this election. Clearly, if you look at the media coverage, people who have done studies of the media coverage, and Joe Biden, as did Hillary Clinton back in 2016, Joe Biden got much more favorable coverage from the corporate media than Donald Trump did. And so, for example, they either didn't report on, certainly didn't try to interview Tara Reid, the woman who accused Joe Biden of raping her back in the 90s, or if they did report on it, they engaged in smears against her, basically calling her a liar, but interestingly not challenging the credibility of Joe Biden's denials that that he had done this, in spite of the fact that he has a long, indisputable record of not telling the truth. Um, so that certainly was in play. Um, but aside from that, uh, really, I mean, did they really need to rig the election for Joe Biden in terms of rigging the vote count? Well, let's think about that. Donald Trump has been, according to opinion polls, the most unpopular president in the entire history of polling, going all the way back to the 1930s. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't have a base of very strong supporters that's pretty sizable. Yes, we all know that. But they're far from being a majority of the population. Um, in addition to that, although he might have been, as incumbent presidents generally are, in a decent position to win the election back toward the beginning of the year, when the Democrats were basically shooting themselves in the foot by, for instance, impeaching Trump and trying to kick him out of office, rather than letting the voters decide that in the fall, but trying to kick him out of office back in the early part of this year, based on really pretty trivial offenses. Whereas they could have gone after him for his immigration policy or nepotism, violating the emoluments clause and setting things up so that his relatives reaped enormous financial benefits from his being president, or they could have gone after him for war crimes, such as the illegal occupation of the part of Syria that happened to have its oil fields and wheat fields. Um, they certainly could have gone after him for more important things than what they did go after him for, which was supposedly withholding military aid to the authoritarian, fascist-dominated at the time regime in Ukraine, in order to supposedly blackmail them into firing, a prosecutor who would have investigated Joe Biden's or Joe Biden's son's activities in Ukraine. So they went after him over that, and it didn't really go well. Trump's popularity went up to its highest level, although it still was not majority favorable. But then along came the pandemic, and Trump's response to that, as well as to some extent his response to the protests over this summer about George Floyd's murder, and Breonna Taylor's as well, that his authoritarian crackdown on those protests also didn't do him any favors. But probably the main thing driving his decline in popularity from already not so high levels was the many things he did wrong in responding to the pandemic, which is not to say that other politicians, such as Cuomo, Governor Cuomo in New York, didn't also respond pretty incompetently to the COVID-19 outbreak. But as the President of the United States, Donald Trump, to some extent, rightly, got a lot of blame for how the U.S. has failed miserably at dealing with this by the public, and that hurt him a lot. Because if you look at opinion polls, leading up to the election, Joe Biden consistently held a lead about twice the size of Hillary Clinton's lead in the opinion polls going into the 2016 election. And what I wanted to tell you about today was some data that group called TDMS Research gathered on the exit polls, where they compared the exit polls for the 2020 presidential election, the general election in November, with the reported vote counts. And there's one exit poll that's done every major election in the United States by a firm called Edison Research, where they do the poll for a consortium of most or all of the networks and major newspapers and so forth. And they polled about 20,000 people this time. Roughly 15,000 people were interviewed as they were leaving the polling locations and asked who they voted for, and demographic information was gathered for them, like age and race and all that. And they also did the same thing to try and get a sense of how people who voted absentee or voted early voted. They did interview some of the early voters in person, but most were reached on the phone, as were the mail-in voters. Roughly 5,000 people were called and asked who they voted for. And exit polls are generally pretty accurate because they have a far larger sample size than polls leading up to the election. Polls prior to the election are generally fairly accurate, at least if the election is not close. They predict the winner correctly the vast majority of the time. But exit polls are even better. They're kind of the gold standard that's used in elections around the world to decide whether there's reason to be suspicious that somebody rigged something. So if the actual vote count doesn't match up pretty closely with the exit polls, then yes, sure, there could be something wrong with the exit polls, but you at least have to consider the possibility if the vote count in the exit polls are so far apart that it's outside the margin of error, where you would expect the discrepancy to fall within 95% of the time, just by chance. Then that raises the possibility that maybe the election was rigged for whoever won it, or maybe it was rigged for the loser, but it just wasn't rigged enough for him or her to win. So anyway, what they found in their look at the discrepancies between the exit polls and the reported vote count was that in 22 out of the 24 states where exit polls were conducted, Donald Trump beat the exit poll prediction, or post-diction, I guess you could say, by more than the margin of error. And also nationally, Trump did better than the exit poll predicted by more than the margin of error. And similarly, Biden underperformed. So overall, the margin that the exit polls predicted that Biden would win the election by was 6.4%. And at the time that they did this, Biden's margin was only 2.9%, which a lot of mail-in ballots came in after that, or were counted, I should say, after that, and bumped his margin up to just under 4.5%. But that's still, about a 2%, almost a 2% discrepancy between what the exit polls said the outcome would be and what the actual popular vote percentages were. So that's a pretty big miss for an exit poll for a poll of that size. 20,000 voters. Either there's some major systematic bias in how the sample for the exit poll was obtained, which that could be the case because it was certainly argued that the pre-election polls in 2016 were off by the significant amount that they were, partly because there was systematic undersampling of, I believe it was systematic undersampling of educated or seeming less educated voters in the 2016 polling. But the other possibility, not that these are mutually exclusive, but the other possibility is that there was some election fraud, election rigging going on. So it's possible that the voter suppression that, as I've said, Republicans engage in pretty much every general election. A lot of those Georgia voters, for example, that I talked about earlier, those 200,000 or so voters, predominantly from demographic groups that tend to favor Democrats, many of them were not able to fix their registration in time to vote in this election. So there's kind of a mad scramble in Georgia to get people registered to vote who want to be registered to vote in time for the runoff elections for the Senate that are coming up pretty soon. Anyway, so what I did that I'd like to talk briefly with you about is I got the updated totals nationally and for each state, and I I don't have that at the top here. Let's see. Here we go. So I got the exit poll data from the website that I just showed you, TDMS Research, and I got the actual results from uselectionatlas.org, one of many sites that has the final vote tallies, both nationally and for each of the 24 states where exit polls were conducted. And I calculated a difference for each of them between the actual result and the prediction from the exit poll for Biden for each state and nationally, and then for Trump for each state as well as nationally. And then I compared the two statistically. So here's what I got when I ran the statistical analysis. So bear with me if you don't understand statistics. Basically, what you see here is Joe Biden underperformed the expected result from the exit poll by on average about 1.4%. Donald Trump, on the other hand, overperformed the expected result from the exit polls by 2.3%. And there's no question that this difference is highly unlikely to have happened just by chance. The probability value that I obtained in the statistical analysis of this difference between these two groups of discrepancies between expected results and actual results was a highly statistically significant probability of well under 1 in 1,000, under 0.001, that this difference could have happened just by chance. If you know statistics, these are effect sizes here, and maximum effect size you can have is 1. So this difference is accounting for 51% of the overall variation, in discrepancy between results and exit polls, which is pretty huge. Okay, so what can we conclude? basically, there are only two possibilities. Either there was a major systematic error in the way the sample for the poll was obtained, which it seems kind of unlikely that there was this huge an error, given that pollsters have been conducting exit polls in countries all over the world that have accurately called the results of elections time after time, and so exit polls are often used as sort of a barometer that tells you, hey, we should suspect election rigging here, because this discrepancy is bigger than you would expect by just by chance, by a lot. Or basically the Republican Party, as they've done in past elections, the 2016 presidential election, 2000 presidential election, 2018 Georgia governor's race, and undoubtedly many others. They've put their finger on the scales and suppressed the vote, resulting in Donald Trump doing better and Joe Biden doing worse than the polls would lead you to expect. Now, as for claims that there was rigging on the part of the Democrats to favor Joe Biden, let me get back on camera here. Yeah, that could be. But the question is, was that enough for Joe Biden to be the reason why Joe Biden won the election? And if you look at the exit polls or the pre-election polls or just what happened over the course of the year, where Donald Trump did some things that were extremely unpopular, and Joe Biden kind of sat in his basement and let that happen. Tried not to screw up too badly, and meanwhile the media was doing its part to cover up all the negative stuff about Joe Biden. They actually censored stories. Twitter and Facebook did, and other folks did. The Intercept infamously censored a story written by Glenn Greenwald about Hunter Biden's evidence found on Hunter Biden's computer of his corruption. They swept the allegations of sexual misconduct by Joe Biden under the rug, or smeared the women who were making them, and otherwise tipped the scales in Joe Biden's favor in ways that, as unfortunate as they are completely legal. So they probably didn't need to rig the election in order for Joe Biden to win. He was popular enough compared to Donald Trump to win without that kind of help. Which isn't to say that there might not have been some minor rigging here and there in isolated places, but overall, it appears that Joe Biden won the election legitimately by more than George Bush won in 2000 or 2004, for example. About the same, actually a little bit more than Obama won the 2012 election by. And he didn't need any help doing it, really, other than the help he got from the media and the rest of the establishment in legal ways. This outcome happened in spite of the fact, it appears, because we know that the Republicans haven't stopped preventing likely Democratic voters from voting. It appears that Biden won by less than he would have. Certainly, the polls suggest that he should have won by more. And actually, the same is true with the congressional races. The polls were predicting, and exit polls post-dicted, that Democrats would do a lot better in congressional elections than they actually did. That's what the evidence suggests at this point. If somebody has evidence in the future suggests that there was major cheating by the Democrats in the general election, certainly we should look at that. But at this point, there doesn't appear to be any. All right. So that's all I wanted to talk about today. Please like this video and share it, and give me feedback, comment below the video, and subscribe to the channel. And I will see you next time.